Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. North Korea is facing a confluence of challenges. It is fighting a COVID-19 outbreak despite its efforts to fend it off during past 2 years by a tight border closure. At the same time, the country is suffering a drought while it is still struggling in the economic aftermath of the sanctions. Today, we'll discuss these and more.
We absolutely will, and we certainly, as we attempted in this last resolution, will push for additional sanctions.
In the studio with me is William Brown, professor at the University of Maryland Global Campus. Professor Brown spent 3 decades in the U.S. government, including the CIA and the Commerce Department, focusing on the North Korean and Chinese economies. Also joining me is David Maxwell, senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and the Global Peace Foundation. Colonel Maxwell was a planner for the United Nations Command and the Combined Forces Command. Thank you so much for being with us today. Really good to have you both in the studio.
Yes. Fun to be here.
Thank you. Great to be back.
Thank you. Only recently, North Korea admitted to the outbreak of coronavirus. And North Korea shut its borders for the past 2 years. And it hit the country's economy pretty hard. Professor Brown, will the new outbreak of the coronavirus make the situation worse?
I think there's no doubt that it's already becoming quite bad. You know, with North Korea, we're always talking about how poor the economy is. Usually they struggle through, they kind of meander along. It's always very poor place, though. But now the level of hysteria coming out of North Korea seems different. Seems quite different. What the media is talking about, what Kim Jong-un is talking about. It's a little bit scary. Maybe it's temporary. Maybe they'll get over it quickly. But for right now, at the early June, it looks like a very, very difficult time in North Korea.
Right. Colonel Maxwell, it is obvious North Korea is going through economic difficulties. Do you think the current situation is comparable to the Great Famine they experienced in the 1990s?
Yes, but I also think it's potentially worse. And that's really because in the 1990s, while it was tremendous suffering, the North had some safety valves. The first one was the implementation of the Sunshine Policy in the South, which transferred hundreds of millions of dollars to the regime, and that really saved the regime. The second safety valve was a development of the markets. After the public distribution system failed, the people developed markets, and up to today, there's some 400 markets that are operating. The difference is that today there won't be any relief monetarily because there can be no sunshine policy with the sanctions that are in place and the financial restrictions under U.S. law. And also, Kim Jong-un has used COVID to crack down on the markets, to stop movement, and really to shut down information flow, access to currency. And so there's really no relief valve for the people. Because of that, we really have to watch for indicators of growing instability, which could really be a threat to the regime. So like Professor Brown, I'm very concerned, and I think we need to really watch closely because something could happen inside North Korea. We can't predict what will happen, when it will happen, but we need to be ready and observant for the indicators that might tell us what will happen.
Professor Brown, what are the signs that North Korean economy is really in a dire situation?
I think the major sign is the North Korean media itself, what they're announcing on KCNA every day now. Just looked at it today. So all these worries, they're very worried. They're talking heroically about all the struggles they're going through, how they're going to maintain. But clearly there's a level of worry in the official media that I haven't seen before. That would be my major indicator. But there are plenty of others also. The trade situation, which I follow fairly closely, has been very, very bad since it's gone progressively downhill. The sanctions came on board. Those, for a long time, were not that meaningful. Then China came on board with them 2017. They became very meaningful. The sanctions basically make it hard for North Korea to earn money. But with the pandemic closures in January 2020, they shut down imports as well. So that actually had some positive impact on their currency, but it's made it impossible for all kinds of materials to come into North Korea, and that's hurting the people. Everybody they are pretty self-reliant, but everybody depends on something from the outside that's not coming in, and so it's been very harmful.
Colonel Maxwell, how do you think that this whole COVID-19 outbreak would have impacted the lives of North Korean people?
I think there's tremendous impact. There's tremendous suffering. And really, the reason for that is the deliberate decisions being made by Kim Jong-un to prioritize not only COVID defense, but also the continued development of his nuclear weapons, his missiles, his advanced military capabilities. And he prioritizes that development over the welfare of the Korean people. And so the decision to shut down the border to both legal trade and smuggling has really had an impact. And the people just don't have the ability to obtain the goods they need from the outside world. And so people are suffering. But they're suffering because of the decisions of Kim Jong-un, and Kim Jong-un is solely responsible for what is happening inside North Korea.
CIA, in its latest update on the World Factbook, estimated economic constraints, particularly resulting from the global impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on North Korea. And it said it has increased the population's vulnerability to food insecurity, and the food gap is estimated at about 860,000 metric tons, equivalent to approximately 2 to 3 months of food use. And recently, North Korea is also fighting against drought. Professor Brown, where do North Korean people get food now?
That data, the 860,000 tons, CIA published that in their fact book. It's old data.
Yeah.
This is work done by the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO, that published a very nice report back in June. So I don't know why they're publishing now. A year makes a difference, so it's a year old. I'm not disputing the number. FAO came up with that number, 860,000 tons. But it's a whole year later now. They had a fairly good harvest, I think, surprisingly good harvest last September. So they're probably, the food situation may not be as dire as that report suggested. The more immediate concern, though, to me is what David was talking about. During the famine era, their socialist system broke down and people stopped getting their rations. That created room for markets to develop, and markets have been growing quite well since then. But recently, the markets have gotten shut by this virus issue. So the concern in the 90s, what they talked about, a famine in place, because food would not move around given the strictures of the communist system. People couldn't buy and sell it, so it just wouldn't move. People would die in one village and be fine in the next village. Markets prevent that from happening because food moves around where it's needed. But now I'm concerned that these markets are not operating well, and you could have, and I think we're seeing some indications, of famine in place. So a little family just running out of food, not having any money. Money becomes the issue, not the ration ticket. And a lot of people don't have any money. So I think the situation now is probably more of a distributional problem rather than a supply problem.
Colonel Maxwell, at a time like this, does North Korea mobilize military to ease the situation? Is there any way?
Well, I think we're seeing that. We're seeing the military mobilize. And we should remember that the military is really the best functioning institution inside North Korea. And so they are using the military to distribute medicine, and humanitarian assistance. It's possible that the military has been vaccinated. There are reports that they've used Chinese vaccines with the military. There's other reports, though, that they've accepted no vaccines. And of course, we've heard Kim Jong-un refuse support from South Korea, the United States, and the international community. The problem is, if the military is not well vaccinated and they're exposed to COVID, that could really, and an outbreak occurs within the military, that could really be dangerous, because the loss of coherency of the military, the breakdown of the military because of the pandemic, could lead to loss of military support for the regime. And that could really threaten the regime and create instability inside North Korea. So I think the regime is desperate. They depend on the military, but they're taking risk by exposing the military in trying to stem the COVID outbreak.
I see. Despite all this, North Korea is not stopping its efforts to advance the nuclear and missile programs. Now, according to CIA, again, between 2010 and 2019, military expenditures accounted for an estimated 20 to 25% of North Korea's GDP annually. Professor Brown, how significant is this number?
The number itself is, very much of an estimate. I made an estimate for them about 40 years ago, gave the same number basically, 20, 25% of GDP. 15, I think I said 15 to 20% of GDP. But there's no question it's a lot, that the North Korean government spends a huge amount on its military, probably more than almost any other country imaginable. What that does is, if you think of a GDP, all the production of a country, usually, say in America, 70% or so is consumed. We live well, we eat up 70% of what we make. A country like China has grown very well by consuming maybe 50 or 60% of its GDP, leaving what? Leaving 40% for investment. So China, we all know, has been on this incredible investment tirade for 30, 40 years, and it results. You see all the result of that. In North Korea, their income levels are so low, they probably consume 50, 60% GDP. If 25% more goes toward military, and another probably 20% to the administration of the government, that leaves nothing for investment. So what I've been seeing in North Korea over the last 10 years is extremely little investment.
Colonel Maxwell, North Korea is often criticized for allocating the resources to wrong places. Why isn't this changing?
Well, because I think, first of all, the regime, Kim Jong-un, prioritizes the survival of the regime, the elite, and the military over the welfare of the people. And I think in addition to the economy, the internal economy that exists, North Korea is conducting illicit activities around the world, from counterfeiting money, cyber theft, other illicit drug trafficking, overseas slave labor. All of these are designed to bring funds to the regime. And those funds could be part of the GDP, even though they're illicit. But Kim uses those to fund his military and to fund the elite, and not for the welfare of the people. And I think this is one thing we should keep in mind with the COVID paradox, which I like to call it, because on the one hand, the regime is deathly afraid of COVID. On the other hand, the regime has used COVID as an opportunity to further oppress the people, to prevent resistance. And they've instituted these draconian population and resource control measures to really prevent resistance. The regime could use its existing funds, its illicit funds that it raises, for the welfare of the people, but it chooses not to.
And it is widely suspected that North Korea is preparing for its 7th nuclear test, and the U.S. said it'll pursue new sanctions if North Korea does conduct a nuclear test. And China and Russia recently vetoed UN Security Council's push for new sanctions on North Korea. But if North Korea actually does test nuclear weapons, wouldn't China and Russia, wouldn't they have to change their stance?
Well, I think that in today's situation of strategic competition, we cannot expect any help from China and Russia to solve the security problems of South Korea and the United States with regard to North Korean nuclear weapons. I think it's clear that China and Russia look at the dilemma and the distraction that Kim Jong-un causes the United States as positive for them. Now, I think it's important, as our UN ambassador the U.S. ambassador to the UN said, we should try to impose sanctions. We should recommend them, if only to keep China and Russia on the record of supporting North Korean malign activities. And the three of them, Xi, Putin, and Kim Jong-un, are demonstrating that they are not acting as responsible members of the international community. And so if they test, we should push for sanctions, but we should also improve our military readiness, ensure and demonstrate our strategic reassurance and strategic resolve and extended deterrence to defend South Korea.
Professor Brown, if the United States push for additional sanctions on North Korea, is there any area that can really press North Korea?
I think really not. I think U.S. has never traded with North Korea. We have huge sanctions. We've always had huge sanctions on North Korea. I don't think there's much more that we can do in economic sanctions. There's other things other countries could do, but I think it's important to recognize that the sanctions are in place. It's not, a sanction doesn't have to be constantly put on. It's like you've turned the water off. It's not coming on. Maybe a little bit of a dribble through smuggling, and maybe you can tighten that valve a little bit, but the valve is closed basically. North Korea is not trading. It's not being able to export. I don't know what more we could do, stop more exports. It's just nothing more for them to export. So the critical thing is really China and maybe Russia. Again, though, I think we have to recognize, I'm quite agreement. China does not deal with North Korea on our behalf or on South Korea's behalf. It does it on its own behalf. I'm convinced China does not want a nuclear state in North Korea.
The Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, recently said there's when it comes to North Korea, China has a major role to play. And Sung Kim, who's now visiting Seoul, he also stressed China's role in denuclearizing North Korea. Is China really a lifeline for North Korea?
It is, and I think we have to recognize that the neighboring states, they're ideologically close. They have a long history. They fought a war with us. There's a limit to what we can do with North Korea, as long as China, maybe a little bit Russia, don't want it to happen. So we have to work with China. I'm completely convinced of that. If we don't work with China, it puts North Korea in kind of a tricky spot. They have to decide how much do they want to depend on China. All this juche kind of talk, they don't want to depend on China either. So there's room, I think, for us to maneuver there. One thing I like to point out, though, is that, with petroleum, North Korea does not produce any petroleum. It has no petroleum resources. All of its petroleum comes from China. The crude oil comes free, and China has always given them a substantial amount of crude oil. They buy petroleum products within the UN sanctions limit, and then more than that. But China has a little pipeline into North Korea, crude oil pipeline. They can turn the valve on that and really squeeze North Korea. They don't.
I have a little different take as well, because I actually think that it is not the nuclear weapons that concern China as much as instability or war. Yeah. I think the three no's: no war, no collapse, and no nuclear weapons. They're 2 out of 3 is pretty good there. And so I think that the reluctance of China to really pressure about nuclear weapons may be reluctant to do so out of fear that it could cause instability. And so, shutting off that last lever, petroleum, could do tremendous damage. And if that creates instability in North Korea, I think that is a greater risk to China than a nuclear test. And so I think that's what restrains China from really trying to pressure North Korea about nuclear weapons.
So then my last question for today, Colonel Maxwell first. What is the way out for us? I mean, North Korea is ramping up. I mean, they're, raising our sort of expectations that they're going to have a 7th nuclear test. Can we stop it, or shall we just wait for it and then start talking?
Well, our policy has been we're ready to talk, willing to talk anywhere, anytime without preconditions. So I really wouldn't want to wait till after a nuclear test to talk. And in fact, if they conduct a nuclear test, I think all bets are off. But I think that a nuclear test is not something we can necessarily prevent. They are going to test, I think, for 2 reasons. One is if they must advance their program. They may have to test a nuclear weapon to see if they've sufficiently miniaturized one to put on an ICBM. And then, of course, they do conduct tests as part of their political warfare strategy, their blackmail diplomacy, to really put maximum pressure on us to try to get sanctions relief. We have to recognize North Korea's strategy, we have to understand it, we have to expose it, and we have to attack that strategy with information. And so I also think, just to say, we really need to take a long-term approach. We focus on the nuclear problem. It is a threat, it is a real problem, but it is North Korea that is the problem. And until the Korea question, the unnatural division of the Korean Peninsula, is resolved, really, frankly, until there is a free and unified Korea, we will never see an end to the nuclear program, the missiles. And so I think we have to really take a long-term approach while we have to cope and contain and manage the problems that Kim Jong-un causes all of us.
Mm-hmm. Professor Brown, your final thoughts.
They've created this idea that nuclear weapons protect the regime. I'm thinking the nuclear weapons are the undoing of the regime. And their economy has gone straight downhill. They were a pretty strong economy in the early 1980s when they did not have nuclear weapons. Now they have nuclear weapons, and their economy is in incredibly bad shape. They have, I think the internal security issue, the way that the nuclear weapons problem will be resolved is Kim or somebody in North Korea will realize that the nuclear weapons are creating latent instability in North Korea that they can't deal with. That, to me, is what we should focus on. Not so much the weapons, but the stability. And I don't mean to destabilize North Korea. What I mean is to tell them they are destabilizing North Korea. And we could help them out of that mess, but they are creating a huge mess for themselves.
North Korea, which is under sanctions for developing nuclear weapons in defiance of United Nations Security Council resolutions, has taken over as head of the United Nations Conference on Disarmament this month. Some 50 countries have voiced their criticism that North Korea is being tasked with chairing the body aimed at striking disarmament deals when the country tested a flurry of ballistic missiles and appears to be preparing to conduct a new nuclear test for the first time since 2017. As the State Department made it clear, it certainly calls the forum's effectiveness into question. Professor Brown and Colonel Maxwell, thank you so much for being with us today. It was so good to see you in person.
No, thank you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.